So as Debbie mentioned, my name's Liz, and I'm more than happy to have some offline discussions after today's session, because I think these types of sessions raise a lot of questions about how we can use the data. So if you've got a specific use case, please feel free to reach out to Debbie and the team there at University of Newcastle, or myself directly. Be more than happy to help. So looking at industry and community impact. So we're looking at impact and engagement today. So they're very different, but we can see potential impact through conversations that people are having, things like mentions in policy, patents, news, and you can really get a gauge of what the community sentiment around your research is. Also things, aspects like industry connections with research, and also policy and how that's shaping decision making. So I will, a bit of an agenda today. So firstly, defining impact, which is interesting, looking at that research dissemination, so that reach and engagement, and then I'll go through an example of how to combine some traditional bibliometrics with alternative metrics, and then go through some examples in platform about how we can uncover societal and scholarly impact based on a variety of data points. And really, alternative metrics can be combined with bibliometrics to gain a holistic view of the research produced. So one thing is looking at that impact inside of academia, but today we're focused primarily on that impact outside of academia in community and the industry as well. So firstly, defining impact. So this is a hard one. This can be different to you as an individual researcher. So you might have an idea of the impact that you would like to make. The institution at University of Newcastle might also have another definition of impact. Funders may have a definition of impact, and even countries or national assessments, as we've seen in the previous engagement and impact assessments from the ARC, have had definitions of impact. So I suppose my commentary around this is, when you're going through this exercise, think about who you're defining that impact for, and think about their definition, because it does differ. But some of the things that we do see in many of these applications of in terms of funders or institutions or individuals, we see things like advancing knowledge, research capacity building, informing decision making, health, economics, societal, and impacts, and then the impact practices as well. So these are some of the common things that we find when we're looking at defining impact. And one of the other things to think about is that the people that talk about research are not necessarily researchers themselves. In fact, most of the time they're not. They're general public, they're government policymakers, investigators, and collaborators. There might be, research communicators and watchdogs, practitioners in the field, advocacy and non-for-profits, tech transfer and industry, or other interested parties. So when we're talking about engagement and impact, we need to look at all of these different stakeholders in the research lifecycle. And I really wanted to give a shout out to this website here. So it's definitely not a digital science product, and it's got nothing to do with Altmetric, but I really recommend this for looking at how to build out a plan for impact, and then how to monitor and report on that plan. They have some really good templates and some free resources available. And Mark Reed, who has designed this website in conjunction with some other collaborators, has been involved in the REF assessment in the UK. And it's just some really good resources. There's a free kind of course that you can do online, and they also have a number of videos as well. So if you're starting your journey or want to know more about how you can put a template together, they've got some really good examples there to use. So I just wanted to give them a shout out because I've used them when in my previous position at an institution. I used some of their templates, particularly in the E&I exercise for the ARC, to understand the impact. But it can also help with your dissemination plan as well. One of the other things I'd like to mention, again, this is not a digital science product, but I found a really good example of an impact CV. So here we have things like the quality indicators for, your normal academic type of impact. So internally, you might have things like your citations, your field-weighted citation impact, or even things like collaborations, or when you've been invited to speak at conferences or community engagements. But then you might have other things like the outreach indicators here. So it might be a presentation, it might be mentioned in a policy or patent. It could be a range of things. So again, I've put the link there because I think it's a really great resource to have. Okay, so looking at some actual case studies. So if you are new to Altmetrics, we do cover mentions outside of academia through news mentions, mentions on social media like X, Facebook, things like Wikipedia, also policy. So we follow a range of policy sources globally, and patents as well. So there's a range of ways that you can have a look at who is talking about your research or where your research has been cited in a non-traditional sense. So through those policy and patents. So this example here is a research output from an author there at University of Newcastle. And we can have a look at this in the Altmetric platform and see that it's been mentioned in 3 policy documents and also 11 patents, as well as a range of other means. So news, blogs, X, Facebook, Google+, when it existed. We can also see that there's a number of citations. So this is coming in from Dimensions, which is the sister platform, which looks at more of a bibliometric approach. But this field citation ratio is very similar to the FWCI if you're used to using that, or their NCI if you're used to using that. So it is that field-based ratio. And we have an average of 1, so 393 is pretty large. So what we can understand about this using Altmetric Explorer is where it's been mentioned. So some of the really great things I like to use, particularly if you're having to put a summary together, or if you're writing an application, it might be for a funder, or you just want to create a narrative of some sort for any of your research activities, is that if you go onto a details page, you actually see this very high level information. So we can see the number of posts from blogs, news stories, the number of policy documents. X is an interesting one because you have the number of posts by the number of users, but you also have that potential reach, so that upper bound potential engagement that you might have with your research output. Also things like patents, if there's been any Facebook public wall posts, Wikipedia, and we even bring in that citation count from Dimensions. But if you do have your own platform that you use, I'm sure you do, at University of Newcastle for the more bibliometrics, you can use that instead. So I just wanted to show you as I go through how I get to these things, just so that you understand how to navigate to the actual information. So I'm going to actually pull up this in platform, and so we can have a look at that. So here is the details page. So I go to the research outputs tab. I can find the output that I'm looking for. And on this page here, I get that very high level of information, but I can also go into, say, the news, and this is where I will get that high level metric So that's the type of thing that I can put into a narrative, for instance. And then obviously you can go along the top of those and it will show that corresponding to the tab that you're on. So here we can understand who, what, and where. So when we're talking about dissemination and impact, we can start to understand who's mentioning our research and even the sentiment around those mentions. So we recommend looking past the altmetric attention score and looking at what is actually being said about your research output or where it's being cited to understand the full impact that your research output is having. So here we can see that this research output has been mentioned in Pediatric News. This is a tweet. We can see by the National Review's drug discovery. We can see this blog post by the NIH in the US. We can also see over this side, this is from Facebook as a public wall. So it's the American College of Physicians that has mentioned this research output. It's been also cited by a policy document here, a patent here, and also we can see here another committee paper there. So we can start to understand what impact or engagement our research output has been having. And we can write a narrative around this. So I've had a quick go at this, but there are a number of ways that you could write this. So for instance, this one reads, as published in 2014, this publication has an FCR of 393. Now you could use any kind of bibliometric term here. So you might want to have a look at that field-weighted citation index, and you might also want to include things like a journal impact factor if that's important to you, or the quartile of the journal that it's been published in. Again, that's up to you. And then I go on to say it has received this number of citations. This publication has demonstrated significant societal impact, and I've just listed off the policies sources that it's been mentioned in here. And why. So it's been mentioned in the management of asthma in urban youth. So again, you could elaborate that a little further. And then it also has changed industry practice, having been cited in 11 global patents in relation to the biopharmaceutical composition of asthma treatment medications. So it also, we can bring in the news stories. So I've just put in the number here, but you might want to pick out particular news sources that have high reputation in your eyes. So it might be ABC, it might be Foreign Affairs New Zealand, or whatever it might be. If there's a meaningful mention for you, I would encourage you to actually elaborate on that a little bit more rather than just putting in a number, because again, it points to the quality and the reputation of that media outlet. And having an upper bound reach of 1.4 million, so we can start to see the potential engagement with that research output. And we can see that it's been mentioned by science communicators. So how we could understand that is if I go into Altmetric Explorer and go onto the summary tab here. What we can see here, we're on the summary tab on X demographics. This is where we can see who's mentioned it on X platform. So we can see how many science communicators, how many members of the public can actually, and have a look at that ratio. And sorry, I was just looking at a question there from Tracy. I'll get back to you on that, Tracy, if that's okay. We can also have a look here if you're looking at other things to include in some of your narratives, which I haven't included in that narrative, things like Mendeley. So Mendeley doesn't actually contribute to the score, but what it does is allows you to see who from what disciplines are mentioning your research. So again, that's inside of academia, so you might want to add that. And you might want to, say things like the cross-disciplinary impact that you're having inside of academia. But again, we're kind of focused more on that external impact today. So that's one example here. Another thing that we can do, and to kind of socialize and show your impact in the world outside of academia, is start to put things into your reference lists and CVs and applications. So as well as putting the citations in, you can put in news mentions, if it's being mentioned in particular sources of patents and policy as well. And this is also a good thing if you sometimes, you may not be mentioned in a policy or patent, or so using that information about reach is also really important. So this is another way. So again, I'm looking at a researcher. I'm not sure if Claire's on the call, but I've just had a look at her publications over the last, Claire's publications over the last 10 years. And I've just put in some very high level information here. So using a combination of traditional and non-traditional bibliometrics and altmetrics to form this narrative. So we can see the number of publications over the last 10 years. We can see the citation mean and the FCR in a particular field of research. Include funding, where they've received funding from, and over the last 10 years, 73% have received altmetric attention. So that's really interesting, and also it might lean to your discipline and also where you're publishing or hosting your work, and if it is open access or not. So that's something that I'm just going to talk about later, but it's really interesting to see the engagement with your research. So that's a really high level metric, but interesting all the same. And then in terms of news stories, you can again use some of that really high information about it's been mentioned in 23 news stories in 320 news stories in 23 countries. And you can pick out a few there, or you can detail that further. And then we can also see that the policy and patent citations of the work as well. So that's a really nice summary if you haven't got a lot of word space. So I did mention that I was going to have a look at open versus closed publications. But before I go into that, I'm going to show you how we got to some of Claire's metrics in platform. So if I pull that back again, what we can do here is, I'll start again. So for those that didn't join us for the first two sessions, they are recorded, and they will have more details about searching techniques, but I'll just go through this particular one today. So University of Newcastle has an institutional feed into Altmetric Explorer, and that allows us to go on to My Institution Only, and you can look for a particular author. So I can type Claire's name in. Here we go. And then I can build a report on Claire. Now, I might want, if I did want to put that publication date range on, I could do that. So I could do from the last 10 years down here. If I'd like to put things like open access or any other types of information about fields of research, just looking at a very small field of research, if you'd like to have a look at that over the whole corpus of Claire's publications, we can as well. So if I just run that search now, we can see, obviously this number is higher because I'm looking all time, but we can quickly see the number of mentions that Claire has had. We can go to the research outputs page and see which research outputs are having that attention. But when we're doing these types of analyses, what we can also do is start to understand the sources. So here we're started off with X at the top, but I can look at just policy sources. So if I wanted to look at what policy sources have mentioned Claire's research, or if I'm doing this as myself, but as a researcher, or if I'm doing this on behalf of a researcher, you can use this mention sources tab to then have a look at particular sources and then follow the bouncing ball and see where they've mentioned your research. So any of the, while that loads, I'll just mention any of the citations towards your work from patents, policy, even things like X, you can then go out to the original platform and have a look at that in more detail. So here we see the mentions for Claire's research. So that's where you can get that very high level information, or you can dig down to see how your research has been mentioned in these sources. So you can just choose a source that you're interested in doing that there. If I'd like to look at the actual mentions, I can see here that this news article, for instance, has mentioned a research output of Claire's and another research output. So you'll see this blue tick here. That means that it's a verified research output from University of Newcastle. And because I've put Claire into the parameters for my search, it will only reflect those research outputs with the blue tick. So that's where you can start to understand maybe some of the sentiment and the mentions behind that research output. If you'd like to do this, so I appreciate that it might not always be for an individual, it might be for a department, say. So if you'd like to do that, we can go into the edit search and have a look at a department there. So it might be science. So it might be psychological sciences. So again, we can do that report for that department or school level as well. Likewise, you might want to do this for a group of researchers to have a look at that impact. You can just paste a list of scholarly identifiers into this window here that they have collaborated on, and then again go through that process of having a look at the policy and patents. So if I actually bring up that again, sciences, I'll show you some little techniques about looking at impact. So if I go to the research outputs page now, what you'll find is by default, the platform will sort by Altmetric attention score, but we can change this to look at things like policy documents. So that will resort. So I can quickly identify those with high policy documents and or even some policy mentions and having that potential impact. I can do that for patents as well. So I can start to understand if they've been mentioned in a patent very quickly. All right, so I'm going to go on to open versus closed, because when we're talking about impact, we can see some really interesting things here about open and closed publications or research outputs. So I did a little bit of analysis for the University of Newcastle, because what we see is sometimes for patents in particular, if it's a closed output, you might have very different people, organizations citing your work when you have open. And this is based on subscriptions, it's based on industry, but really good at an institutional view to have a look at that information. But you can also do this at a school department level or even individual level. So I'll show you how to do this, but I'll just present the information first. So here we can see, so these are related to the colours here. We can see things like engineering, biological sciences, biomedical and clinical sciences is quite large here, representation, chemical sciences, and then information sciences more in the later years. And we can see the organisations that have referenced in their patents the work from University of Newcastle. So a lot of institutions in there, institutes, which Regeneron, there in the US. So really interesting. If we look at open, we see a similar pattern in terms of biomedical and clinical sciences, engineering, but we also now see things like psychology creep in. So there we have some of those publications that have been mentioned by psychology. And we can start to see, because they're open, they have a different set of organisations that have been citing them in their patents. So really interesting analysis to do. And I will go into, and you can do this for policy as well. So we can start to understand, do we get more policy mentions from World Health Organization if it's open? And then what is that engagement that leads on from that? But if I go into platform, what we would do is use this field down here. So it's a type of open access. So I can look at open access only, which will tick bronze, green, gold, and hybrid. Sometimes you may want to include bronze, sometimes you may not want to, depending on your discipline and your field. So we can do that. And we can also put a year range on this, because I think when you're doing some kind of landscape analysis, it's good to put that year range on. And then you can run that search. So apologize, it's taking a little while, but while it's loading, I'll keep talking. So this way we can have a look at the mentioned sources, and we can actually export this information. So the way that I came up with those graphs is I exported the information and then analyzed it outside of the Altmetric Explorer. So we can see here a number with patents, and some which is represented by orange, so I can see that straight away because it's sorted by patents. But if I go policy documents as well, I can do that and have a look that way. Usually we find with policy there are a lot of other mentions by like news and X, just because of the different natures of those two applications. We can go over to the mentioned sources tab now, and then we can download that. So if I wanted to look at all policy, I can download that. I can download the full corpus if I like, but you can then work outside of Altmetric Explorer to put some of those graphs together and understand who's been able to access, whether that's been industry, to have that relationship. And I think you understand what I'm trying to get at here, and I'll just leave that to run while I continue. Okay. Another thing that we can do is it's really important to report to funders. So sometimes they are interested in what engagement and what impact you've had in the community and broader context. So you can use Altmetric Explorer in this instance as well. So here I've done a quick query when looking at all research outputs from the University of Newcastle funded by the ARC. So again, that's very broad. You might want to do this at an individual level. You might want to do this at a group level or department level to understand the impact from funding that you've had. And again, I'll show you how to do that in platform. Still spinning. So if I go back to the start, down here you can see funder name. So again, I can just type in Australian Research Council. We can put a year range on that. We can also, I mean, sometimes it's interesting to do a combination of Australian, like it might be the funder and it might be open access. But what we can also do is have a look for a particular FOR code. So if you are if you don't want to do it by department, you'd like to do it by discipline instead, you can use this field here. But I'll go and have a look at a department level. So maybe we'll do engineering this time. And I'll make sure I tick my institution only. And then we can see the total number of outputs tracked, the outputs with attention. So if I primarily look at policy and patents when I'm looking for a very clear application of impact but engagement may be things like news and blogs. With blogs, we see a lot of posts about citizen science, which is really great, and Facebook as well. So a lot of those community groups, it's really interesting to see their commentary and reference to research outputs. So I'm just going to start with policy and patents here. And we can see very quickly we've got 152 mentions and from patents, and 23 mentions from policy documents for the School of Engineering that's been funded by the Australian Research Council. So some really quick wins there. One of the other things we might want to see is, some of the sentiment around that research. So we can start to have a look at news. So if I just bring out that, we can see those mentions and what sources are mentioning that research really quickly. Again, even this one has mentioned 2 research outputs. We can see that this is the one from the University of Newcastle. We can have a look at that in terms of demographics, so where in the world. And again, these snapshots are really interesting to include in reports. So we can see that in terms of X, if you're looking for reach, and we can have a look at Facebook, news, and policy as well. So we can understand really quickly geographically where we're having that impact. And sometimes it might be a local impact or a local reach, and depending on your research, that might be a great thing. So it's not all about global reach. It could be having a high impact in a very small geographical area, and high engagement as well, which is also something that could be really interesting to talk about. Now, I realise I did have some questions in the chat, so I'm just going to have a look at that. So Tracy, I'll just, while I just have a break from that searching, if you know your research has been cited in places not listed, can you add links? We can. So depending on the source type it is, Tracy, so we do cover blogs, news, policy, patents, of course, other things like Facebook, X. So we don't follow all of X, so we only really follow X accounts that are mentioning scholarly outputs. Same with things like Facebook. We don't obviously cover all news articles. We only cover the news articles that are mentioning research outputs. So if you do have a source that you would like included, please let us know. So I will, in my follow-up email, provide a link to suggest a source. So our team's always adding policy sources. In terms of patents, we're pretty well covered there. So we get our patent information from the IFI Claims, which is a sister company under Digital Science, and that has a global representation, and it actually informs Google Patents. So it's got a very comprehensive coverage. But things like, policy, we're always looking to add sources in region, news, blogs. So we had Martin last week, and we've requested his to be added, and I think that's going to be very soon. So definitely can always add things, Tracy. It just needs to have the correct metadata for to be able to be tracked. So it needs things like the DOI, author IDs, but I can, again, provide some follow-up information about that as well in written form. My pleasure. I'm just going to pause there to see if there are any other questions at this point in time. I can go through a few more examples, but while we're taking questions, please either verbalise them or pop them in the chat if you feel more comfortable doing that. I'm just going to take a sip of water while I wait for someone. If anyone's going to put any questions up. Also, and sorry, I should also mention things like videos. So if you do have a media content like that, if it's on YouTube, we can track it if there's a DOI or identifier in the caption. Other than that, placing it on your institutional repository and then getting an identifier, whether that's a handle. So if you wanted to bring attention to those, we can do that way as well. So there's two ways there, looking at YouTube as a source and looking at the actual research output being a media file as well. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
As you probably know, Twitter and X sometimes could be contaminating in a way, because
yes.
there are a lot of those accounts that really has nothing to do with academic, often tag in. And is there any way that academic can control, delete, or somehow get rid of that? Because it is pretty much nothing to do with the research. It is advertising of some odd things that probably by bot that has been tagged onto some of the tweet of our paper.
Right. Yeah. So so two things on that. So firstly, with X, so if I just go into a research output, great question. When we go into a research output, and if I go over to the, if I just stay on the summary tab, and if I have a look at this, what I can see, what we usually find, you're right. So there could be things like bots and other mentions where it's not really relevant. But so we do use the breakdown here. So we usually find those types of posts in this section here, members of the public, rather than these three sections here. So we do use those categories from X. We don't follow all of X, so we do some curation. So they must be mentioning research outputs to try and avoid bots. But and another thing we do promote is to actually look at the mentions. So that's why I mean, yeah, I do definitely take your point, but I would look at the sentiment. So if I went into, say, a mention, just going to go into this one here, I can start to understand their profile and if I'd like to include that in one of my narratives or not. But in terms of curating for, if it's just it mentions your research output, but it's kind of selling something or doing something else. I mean, I don't see that too often in my time going through Altmetric, but I mean, you can definitely raise a support ticket with our team to try to have that removed. But we're just following that identifier that's in the post. So if it's a DOI or other persistent identifier. So it's hard for us to curate that type of level of,
Yep.
But we can definitely try. So if you'd like to reach out to the support team, they might be able to help you in removing some of those if you've experienced that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah. So probably didn't give you the answer you wanted, but yeah, and we do understand that, and that's why we do say, like, look past the score, look past the mentions. It's great to use these types of high level metrics, but really looking at those ones that interest you and the ones that you can write about in a positive way. Yeah. Were there any other questions? Okay, no worries. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to run through a few more examples, and we can do some on the fly and have a look at how we can write some narratives around them. So, and if anyone's got a particular example they want to look at, please feel free to mention that as well. I'm more than happy to I like a challenge. So I'm more than happy to do one on the fly for someone that has a particular use case. Right, okay, so I'm going to look at, this time I might look at humanities. There we go, I might look at humanities and social sciences. And I'm going to, again, tick my institution only. I'm going to do this at a broader level. And I can see here that there's 4 policy and patent mentions, so 4 policy mentions for this particular one. I can see other things like news and blogs. So one of the other things I like to look at is when these mentions have occurred as well. So if I look at the timeline here, I can see when that's output has been, those outputs have been having some attention, and maybe why they're having that attention at that particular point in time. So you can see the peaks of attention there. And if I just want to have a look at policy, I can see when it's being mentioned. So if I go into this one, for instance, I can have a look. So that's by the New South Wales Department of Health. And we're looking at horizon scanning and scenario generation of report. So there have been 2 research outputs from University of Newcastle that have been mentioned. So I can click that further. If I also go into mention sources, again at a faculty view, I can start to understand these X profiles and mentions, but I'd like to just have a look at news. We can see the conversation has a number of mentions, ABC at Atlantic, and I can go and view all mentions there. And we can start to understand which research outputs have been mentioned and the sentiment around those. So when we're talking about engagement, how is the community engaging with your research, and how can we write about that? And it also might be for a different audience. So it might be for a community group, and you'd like to show this is the sentiment I have around my research so far, and open to further discussion around that. So we can start to see some of the research outputs that have been mentioned there. If I'd like to look at a specific one, again, I'd go to that research outputs page. I can have a look at, I might go for this one here. That sounds interesting. And we can see again, because it's not all about policy and patent mentions. It could be about some of those other mentions as well. And Facebook, I think, sometimes holds some gems in terms of community groups. So I've seen another example where it's made references in policy and patents, but it's also parent groups and things have been discussing this type of research, which has been really interesting when we're talking about that engagement with research. And then also clinicians in that example as well. Wikipedia is a good one as well. So if I know in academia, we may have a certain view of Wikipedia, but in terms of a reference, but in terms of citing your work, it's really interesting. It's usually very quick to update their references. So we do cover a number of languages in Wikipedia, and just really interesting to see that your research output may be mentioned as a reference in some of those articles as well. And we do bring in the dimension citations. So again, if you've got your own, so I'm sure you've got your own bibliometric platform that you use, but you can see that very high level information there. I'm going to choose another one here. I'm going to go from using the School of Humanities and Sciences because I'd like to show you another important aspect. So if we have a look at patents, look at the sequence of the human genome. Here we go. So I can go over to patents now, and you can see that they've listed there, and we can see the jurisdiction. if you click onto this, it will try to take you to Dimensions, which I have a subscription for, because that has the full record in Dimensions. However, if you don't have Dimensions, that's not a negative, because what we can do is look in Google Patents, and I can bring that title, and I can search for that in Google Patents and it will be there. So we can start to, here we go. I don't know why it came up down there. There we go. So in Google Patents, you again have that record, so you can understand how your research output has been mentioned in a patent, the jurisdictions and applications of your patent, and even any kind of claims, external links, and yeah, the full record there. So IFI claims informs Google Patents, so you can get that information really quickly, easily as well. But similar to policy documents, if I wanted to have a look at how my research output has been mentioned in that policy, we do provide those links and we do have those agreements, so you can download the PDF or have a look at it on the website and see that information really quickly. Okay. I'm going to go over to Facebook. I'm going to have a look here and see what we can find. So these are mostly individuals. So we have here a group here. So I might want to have another one here. So I might want to have a look at that and see what they have to say about these research outputs, and also things like blogs. So there are 30 blogs for this research output. So we can, again, start to understand that sentiment around. But you can use all of these data points to then write those narratives around how the community is engaging with your research and that potential impact that you are having. One of the other things that I mentioned last week is publishing behaviour for impact as well. So we can understand, if we publish in a certain journal or outlet or collection, where do we receive the most patents, policies, blogs? Using their marketing teams as well is really important. So we talked about that in the research promotion session last week, but we can reorder this. So things like the Lancet, of course, but you might want to put a field of research code on this. So let's do that. Or maybe even an SDG. So if we just go, poverty, for instance, and then look at the journals, we can see population, space and place. But if I'd like to have a look at the most patent mentions, so likely none in that particular one, but we can start to understand where we receive the most mentions for that SDG in policy as well. So that's another good tab that's quite underutilized really, but you can use that in that way as well. Are there any other questions? We've got about 7 minutes left. Any particular examples that anyone would like to run through? Like I said, I will provide that slide deck with those examples. Yep, no worries. So I just want to kind of final thoughts is about impact, going beyond the like the reads and downloads and views and listens, and we can definitely get those metrics, and that might be meaningful to you in terms of engagement with your research, but it might not necessarily be defined as impact. So what did people learn? How did they benefit from the research? And keep asking what's happened next. But the great thing about if you want to understand the engagement with your research, and it's not a traditional research output, if you do have it on your institutional repository there at our University of Newcastle, you can then start to see things like if it's been viewed and interacted with. So one of the really interesting things is that we can kind of see that reach and engagement through those other means, as well as looking at Altmetric Explorer, or you could do a combination of those two. So again, if you're in a space where you have more non-traditional research outputs, I highly recommend getting a persistent identifier, getting a handle there at the University of Newcastle's repository, making sure that you can bring that attention to your research output, because Altmetric doesn't just track news and articles, it tracks things like data sets, software code, media files. So as long as it has that identifier, you can start to see the engagement with that. So it might be even things like you had an exhibition and you had an exhibition catalogue. As well as putting things like attendance to the exhibition, you can then, if it's got an identifier, you can then start up that discussion online and actually get some feedback and engagement online about that as well. Yes, thanks, Debbie. So I should mention the name. Yes, so NOVA is the institutional repository. I can bring that up on screen now. I've got a minute. There we go. Goodness. Just go some of these tabs. There we go. So this is the repository here. So if you are from, even if you're from, I say, if it's a non-traditional research output, so STEM also use things like software code and data sets, and they should be celebrated as research outputs in their own right, as well as the traditional publications and books and book chapters, conference proceedings and such. So use your institutional repository. It's a great way to show your research. Also things like compliance with open access and open science as well, and using the FAIR and the CARE principles as well of research, so that then you can get that engagement and potential impact with your research. We do have another session coming up today. So that is looking at a media and comms perspective of research outputs and working together with your media and comms team. So in terms of research promotion, it's about taking that institutional approach. And we've got some tips and tricks from a media and comms perspective, but it might also be of interest to you as a researcher, or if you're supporting researchers, because again, it's building that communication and talking across departments and making sure that you're getting the research recognised, and it can be on the forefront of what's happening in that research as well. So please join that session. I think that yes, I'm not sure if Debbie's put that in the chat, but the next session is coming up soon. So if you can join us this morning, that would be great. I'm just going to remembering. Yes, it's in what's that? In half an hour. So please join, yes, at 11 a.m. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, I'm just looking at my phone there. So yeah, please, couldn't remember if it was half an hour or an hour break in between. So please register for that one. It's a really interesting approach of how you can work with your media team and how the media team can use Altmetric Explorer to identify which sources, particularly news outlets, can be used, and which journalists and reporters could be on dissemination lists for certain fields of research or for certain disciplines as well. So a different look at Altmetric Explorer, but a really interesting one to be there for as well. So thank you very much for your time, everyone, today. And again, please reach